The man arrived at his new property with a hopeful heart and a smile on his face. He had worked hard for this home and he wanted this place to be where he could finally breathe and start again. The moving truck behind him carried the last pieces of his old life. The morning sun lit the streets of the neighborhood and the houses looked neat and lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. He thought it looked perfect from the outside. He had no idea that the first people he would meet were already waiting with masks of politeness hiding sharp plans. As he parked his car and stepped out, a small group approached him. They wore neat clothes, the kind that tried too hard to show authority. At the front was a man with slicked hair and a wide smile that felt stretched too far. Beside him stood two women holding clipboards, their eyes scanning him like he was a number on a list. The man introduced himself as the HOA president and said welcome in a loud, cheerful tone. But behind the smile was a calculation. The newcomer shook their hands politely. He was used to keeping calm and observing before speaking much. They circled around him like hunters pretending to be guides, making small talk about how friendly the community was and how lucky he was to have found such a fine property. He nodded but felt the weight in their words. Then one of the women quickly slipped a folded paper into his hand, saying it was just a welcome notice with a few important details. He opened it, expecting perhaps a schedule of trash collection or community rules. But the bold letters at the top made his eyes narrow. It read arrival processing fee with a large number printed below. He read the details and it claimed he owed money for being a new resident. A strange charge that had nothing to do with property taxes or maintenance. His stomach tightened but his face showed nothing. The president leaned closer and explained with a friendly tone that all newcomers had to pay it. He said it was community tradition and the fee helped keep things smooth. But his voice trembled slightly. The man pretended to read carefully again. The amount was not small, and the note warned that late payment would result in fines. He folded the paper slowly and slid it back into his pocket. His calmness seemed to bother them. They expected confusion or fear, maybe quick agreement. But he only smiled softly and said he would review it later. The board members exchanged glances. They had played this game many times. They had seen new owners panic and pay without question. And when someone asked too many questions, they buried them in fake violations until they gave up. But this man's eyes had a sharpness they did not like. As the movers carried his furniture inside, the HOA group lingered, talking about all the important rules they enforced, mentioning stories of other residents who had been fined. They told it like warnings dressed as friendly advice. Neighbors across the street peeked through curtains, some whispering quietly to each other. It was clear this was not the first time such a scene had happened. One older neighbor shook his head with pity. The newcomer noticed but said nothing. Inside his heart beat steady. He was not surprised. He had expected something like this. He had seen many faces wearing smiles that hid greed. He decided to play along for now. The president reminded him again about the payment and said he would be back tomorrow to collect. Then they left, still smiling but whispering among themselves as they walked down the street. The man stood in his doorway watching them go, his face unreadable. Inside he thought about how fast the trap was set the moment he arrived. He looked at the paper again. The numbers printed there were meant to scare, meant to test if he was weak or strong. He took a deep breath, then looked up at the row of houses that seemed quiet but carried stories in their walls. He knew one thing. The game had already begun. But they did not know the truth about him, not yet, and that secret made him smile for the first time that day. His calmness was not ignorance, it was patience, because while they believed they were the hunters, they had no idea they had already stepped into the cage themselves. The next morning the man woke up early. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of sprinklers clicking and birds calling. He brewed his coffee and stood near the window, watching the street with calm eyes. He knew they would not wait long. People who lived off scams always moved quickly before suspicion grew. By mid-morning the knock came, sharp and impatient. He opened the door to find the HOA president again with two board members standing stiff beside him, their fake smiles stretched thin but their eyes cold. The president greeted him loudly, talking as if they were old friends, but almost instantly he asked if the man had prepared the payment for the arrival fee. The man tilted his head slightly and said he had looked over the paper. He asked in a soft voice if the president could explain where in the community bylaws such a rule was written. The president chuckled nervously and said the bylaws were complicated, that newcomers rarely had time to read them, that it was better to trust the board. One of the women spoke sharply, saying if he delayed payment the fines would stack up quickly. Her voice carried the weight of someone used to scaring people into obedience. But the man did not flinch. Instead he sipped his coffee slowly and leaned against the doorframe. He said calmly that he would like to see an official record. His lack of fear made them restless. The president quickly shifted the topic. He pointed at the man's car parked in the driveway and claimed it was against community standards. He said the car was too close to the sidewalk. Another violation they could fine him for. The man only smiled faintly and said he measured carefully before parking. His voice polite but firm. The president's face twitched. He was not used to being challenged in such a quiet way. Usually people argued, begged, or paid up. But this man's silence and patience unsettled him. Neighbors across the street pretended to sweep driveways or check mailboxes. But their eyes were fixed on the scene. Some whispered that the new guy was already in trouble. Others muttered that maybe he was braver than he looked. The board members huddled closer together. The president pulled out another paper. This one claiming an immediate violation with an even higher fine. He shoved it forward with a grin that tried to cover his nerves. The man took it gently and read every word. His calmness stretched the silence until even the birds seemed to stop. Then he looked up and said in an even voice that he would handle it, but not today. He thanked them for their time and closed the door slowly in their faces. The slam they expected never came, just the sound of the latch clicking firmly. Outside, the board members whispered angrily. One woman said he was playing games. Another said he was disrespectful. The president raised his hand to silence them. He muttered that maybe the new guy needed more pressure, that they would flood him with notices until he broke. As they walked away, the man stood inside holding both papers, his lips curved slightly. He could feel the pattern already. They wanted him cornered. They wanted him desperate. But desperation was a game he had never lost. He placed the papers on the table neatly and went back to his coffee. His mind steady, his eyes sharp. Outside, the street seemed normal again, but under the surface something dangerous had already begun. The board believed they had power, but they did not know the truth about who really owned the ground they stood on, and with every fake notice they pushed into his hands, they were only digging their own grave a little deeper. That evening the man sat on his porch quietly, the papers from the HOA resting on the small table beside him. He had not thrown them away, nor had he signed anything. He simply let them sit there like silent proof of what kind of people he was dealing with. The sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on. He noticed how the neighbors peeked through their curtains again, their faces half hidden but their eyes curious. Some looked worried. Others looked almost eager to see what would happen next. It was clear this was a place where fear had settled in long ago. Then he saw an old man from down the street walking slowly with his dog. The man nodded politely and said good evening. The old man hesitated, looking left and right, then leaned closer and whispered that the board always did this. He said they bullied every newcomer, forced them to pay fake fees, and if they refused, the board invented violations until the person either gave in or moved away. His voice shook with bitterness as he added that many residents wanted to fight but no one dared. The newcomer listened quietly, thanked him for the warning, and offered no more. But inside his mind he was putting the pieces together. The next morning another knock came. This time louder and sharper. The president stood there again, flanked by more board members. This time there were 4 of them, their clipboards stacked high. They smiled in that fake way again and told him he now had multiple violations. One for the grass not being trimmed, another for leaving boxes from moving in near his garage, even a claim that his curtains were not the right color. The list went on and on, all of it ridiculous. But each page carried bold numbers for fines. The man stood silent as they read each one. The neighbors began to gather, some standing on lawns pretending to check flowers, some holding phones as if they might record. The air was heavy with tension. The president finished his long speech and thrust the papers at him, expecting anger, expecting fear. But the man only took them carefully and stacked them neatly in his hands. He looked each board member in the eye one by one, his calm stare unsettling them. Finally he said in a low, even voice that he appreciated their effort, that he would take care of everything in due time. Then without another word he turned his back and walked inside, leaving them standing there with their smiles frozen and their authority suddenly feeling weak. Inside he laid the new stack of notices next to the old ones, neat piles of empty threats. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat back, his heart steady. He thought about how they kept adding pressure. But he also knew something they did not. He was not just a homeowner. He was the man behind the very company that owned the deeds of many of these houses, including some of the board's own homes. He had stayed quiet for a reason. He wanted to see how far they would push, how much greed they would reveal before the truth came crashing down. That night the neighbors whispered louder, some saying he was finished, others saying maybe he was the one who could finally break the board. Inside his living room the man sat in silence, the papers like trophies of their arrogance stacked before him. And in that silence he decided he would not speak of the truth yet. He would wait, he would let them believe they were winning, because when the moment came, their fall would be greater, and the whole neighborhood would see exactly who had the real power all along. That night the man slept lightly, his mind alert though his body rested. When morning came he stepped outside to find fresh papers already taped to his front door. The board had moved fast, the stack of violations grew thicker, this time accusing him of leaving his porch light on too long, of parking his car at a slight angle, of having boxes in his recycling bin that were not cut flat. He peeled each notice slowly, his hands calm, his eyes steady. As he pulled the last paper free he noticed something. Across the street a young woman quickly turned her head away from the window as if afraid to be seen. He carried the papers inside and placed them neatly with the rest. His pile had become a tower of lies, still he smiled faintly. Outside the sun was rising but the air carried tension like a storm waiting to break. Later that day he decided to attend the HOA meeting. He walked down the street with measured steps. The community hall stood at the corner, a low building with polished glass doors that reflected the sky. Inside the room buzzed with voices. The board sat at the front like royalty, the president in the middle, his slick hair shining under the lights. He wore a smug grin as he addressed the residents. He spoke loudly about maintaining standards, about how the board worked tirelessly to protect property values, but beneath his words was pride, greed, and the desire for control. The residents sat in rows of chairs, some nodding out of fear, others sitting stiffly with resentment. The man slipped quietly into a seat near the back, unnoticed at first. As the meeting went on the president mentioned the trouble with a new resident who had not paid his arrival fee. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on the newcomer sitting calmly. The whispers began, people turned their heads, the tension rose. The president cleared his throat and in a louder voice said that rules must be respected, that anyone who refused would face serious consequences. The board members nodded firmly, their clipboards stacked like weapons of paper. The man raised his hand slowly. The room went silent. All eyes turned toward him. He asked in a clear and simple tone where in the official bylaws the arrival fee was listed. The president froze for a moment. Then forced a laugh. He said not everything needed to be written, that some rules were tradition. The man did not argue. He only repeated his question. His calm voice echoing in the hall. Where is it written? Silence stretched. The board shifted uncomfortably. Some residents began to murmur. One old woman whispered that she had asked the same years ago but was ignored. Another whispered that she had been fined until she sold her house. The president's grin faltered. He snapped at the residents to stay quiet, then turned back to the newcomer with narrowed eyes. He said the fee was mandatory no matter what. The man simply leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, his patience endless. The board did not know how to handle such calm defiance. They were used to shouts, to tears, to quick payments, but not this silence that felt heavier than any argument. After the meeting ended the man walked out slowly. Residents watched him with a mixture of fear and hope. One neighbor hurried after him. A man in his 40s who looked tired and worn. He whispered that the board had ruined him with endless fines. He begged the newcomer not to fight, saying they always won. The newcomer looked at him with steady eyes and said softly that sometimes power is only an illusion, then walked on without another word. That night as the street grew dark, the president sat with his board in a private meeting. Their voices sharp, they said the newcomer was different, that he was not breaking, that he was making them look weak. The president slammed his fist on the table and swore he would crush him. But deep down his confidence was shaken. He felt something in the newcomer's eyes, something that made him uneasy, as if the man knew more than he should, as if behind that calm silence lay a truth that could shatter everything they had built. And in that quiet fear the seeds of their downfall began to grow, though they did not realize it yet. The next morning the man rose before sunrise, the sky painted with gray clouds that promised a storm. He stood at his window sipping coffee, watching the street below. The neighborhood looked calm on the surface, but he knew beneath it there was fear and control. He could almost feel the eyes of neighbors hidden behind curtains, waiting to see if he would bend like the rest. By mid-morning a sharp knock rattled his door. When he opened it the president stood there again, this time with nearly the entire board at his side, their clipboards thicker, their smiles thinner, their voices sharper. The president began with fake cheer, saying they had important matters to discuss. He handed over a new packet of papers heavier than before. violation after violation written in bold, claiming his mailbox was too tall, that his blinds were the wrong shade, even that the flowers near his porch were not community approved. Each one carried outrageous fines. The man flipped through the pages slowly, his face unreadable. His silence stretched so long that the board members began shifting nervously. Then the president leaned closer and whispered in a low voice that if he wanted all of this to go away, he just needed to pay the arrival fee and a few processing charges. The whisper was meant to sound helpful, like a secret favor, but it carried the stink of blackmail. The man looked at him with calm eyes and asked again in simple words where in the bylaws such rules were written. The president's smile faltered. He snapped that the board didn't need to explain itself to every homeowner. His voice rose as he accused the man of disrespect. Neighbors had begun to step outside now, pretending to water lawns or collect mail. But everyone's eyes were fixed on the standoff. The tension rippled through the street. The board grew louder, threatening liens, threatening legal action, threatening to ruin his peace. But the man stood there, papers in his hands, his expression steady like stone. When they finished their threats, he simply said, "I will review it all carefully," and began to close the door. His calmness made their anger boil. One woman shouted that he would regret this, that no one defied the board and won. But he only shut the door gently, leaving them shouting to the empty wood. Inside he laid the new stack of papers on the growing pile. The tower now stood tall like a monument of corruption. He sat down and thought of the meeting last night, the whispers of residents who had been crushed, the hopelessness in their eyes. He knew fear had been planted in this neighborhood for years, watered by greed, and now he had become the one spark that could burn it all down. As the storm outside finally broke and rain hit the streets, he felt something shifting. His patience had carried him this far, but soon he would have to act. Because every new violation, every threat, was not weakening him. It was only building the perfect case against them. That night the board met again in secret. Their voices rose with panic. One member said the newcomer was dangerous, that he was not reacting like others. The president barked back that they would break him no matter what. They planned to issue daily fines, to bury him in threats until he had no choice. But under his loud orders there was fear, because when he remembered the man's eyes, he felt like he was not looking at a victim. He was looking at someone who already knew the ending of this story, someone who was only waiting for the perfect moment to turn the trap back on those who had set it. And though the president tried to hide it, a small shiver crawled through him, as if he already sensed that the board's days of control were numbered. The rain had washed the streets clean, but the air in the neighborhood grew heavier with tension. The man stepped outside the next morning and saw fresh notices already fluttering on his door. This time the stack was even thicker than before, pages covered in bold red stamps that screamed violation. The board had not even waited for the last threats to sink in. They were attacking without pause. He peeled the papers off one by one and read them with the same steady patience, accusing him now of dangerous offenses like leaving his trash can too close to the curb or failing to keep his driveway reflective enough. Ridiculous claims meant to overwhelm him. He carried them inside and placed them carefully on the growing tower of papers. His table looked like an archive of corruption, each page evidence of their greed. He smiled faintly and poured coffee. His calmness was no longer just patience, it was strategy. Later that afternoon he attended another HOA meeting. The hall was crowded. Whispers filled the air. Residents eyed him as he entered, some with pity, some with quiet hope. The board sat at the front with their usual smug faces. The president banged the gavel and announced that the new homeowner was in serious violation of community rules. His voice boomed with false authority. He listed every so-called crime, waving papers dramatically. The crowd murmured nervously. Some gasped as if afraid for him. The man raised his hand slowly, his calm presence pulling the room into silence. He asked once again in clear, simple words if the board could show where in the official bylaws these rules were written. The president laughed loudly. Trying to cover his unease, he shouted that not everything needed to be written, that the board's authority was final. The man tilted his head and asked if the board's authority was above the law. The room froze. Residents shifted in their seats, some hiding smiles, others covering their mouths. The president's grin cracked. His face turned red. He slammed the gavel and declared the question out of order. But the damage was done. Whispers spread like wildfire. People were starting to see what they had always feared to say, that the board had no real ground, that their power was a shadow held together by fear. After the meeting the man walked out into the night air. Neighbors approached him quietly, some thanking him under their breath. some warning him to leave before it got worse. One woman whispered that the board had destroyed her family with endless fines until they sold their home. Her eyes carried years of bitterness. He listened quietly, his resolve growing stronger. Meanwhile, inside the board's private office, panic rose. The president shouted that the newcomer was making them look weak, that his calm questions were breaking their grip. He ordered the others to tighten control, to flood the neighborhood with new rules, to make an example out of him. They agreed nervously, but deep down each one of them remembered the look in his eyes, the way he stood unshaken while they blustered. It was the look of someone who was not fighting to survive but waiting to strike. That night in his house the man sat before the tall stack of papers, the storm outside echoing the storm building inside him. He touched the pile gently as if it were treasure, because to him it was. Every notice, every false fine was another weapon he could turn back on them. Another piece of evidence that showed their greed in the open. He leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. The game was not ending. It was only beginning, and soon the board would realize that the hunter they thought was cornered was in fact the one building the trap that would close around them, tighter with every desperate move they made. The next days passed like a drumbeat. Every morning the man woke to find new notices taped to his door. Every evening he returned from errands to see fresh papers shoved into his mailbox. The pile grew taller, a tower of lies that almost touched the edge of his table. Yet he never once raised his voice. He never once showed anger. His silence was louder than their shouting, and the neighbors began to notice. They whispered that maybe this man was different. Maybe he was not afraid. One evening, as he walked down the street, a few residents gathered around him, their faces nervous but curious. One whispered that the board was furious, that they planned to drag him into court. Another warned that the president had been boasting he would crush the newcomer so badly that no one would ever dare question them again. The man listened without interrupting. Then he smiled faintly and said only that truth always wins in the end. His calm words spread like a spark, and for the first time some neighbors looked at each other not with fear but with quiet hope. The next HOA meeting came and the hall was packed. The president strutted at the front like a king, his voice booming. He waved a thick folder and announced that the newcomer now owed thousands in fines. His words dripped with triumph. But when he turned to face the crowd he saw the man already standing, holding his own stack of papers, taller, heavier, thicker. He stepped forward slowly, every eye in the room following him. He placed the entire stack on the table with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the hall. He spoke in calm, simple words, asking if the board was prepared to explain why these charges were not listed in the official bylaws. The president sputtered, tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. The man asked again, his tone steady, "Where are these rules written?" The silence that followed was crushing. Neighbors leaned forward, some gasping, others smiling behind their hands. The board members shifted uneasily, sweat shining on their foreheads. One woman tried to answer but her words tangled. The man did not push. He simply stood there, his presence alone exposing their weakness. Then he added quietly that he had copies of every notice, every violation, every fine, and that if needed he would present them beyond this hall, to people who would not ignore such greed. The room erupted in whispers. The president slammed his gavel over and over, shouting for order, but his red face and trembling hands betrayed him. The man calmly picked up his stack and walked out without waiting for their response. The crowd parted silently as he passed. Some residents touched his arm, whispering thank you. Others nodded with cautious smiles. Outside the night air was cool. He walked home slowly, the street lamps casting long shadows. He knew the board was cornered now, but he also knew desperate animals were the most dangerous. Inside the board's office chaos reigned. The president shouted that the newcomer was a threat, that he was destroying everything they had built. He ordered the others to prepare for war, to unleash every trick, every threat. But deep down, even as he roared, he felt the creeping weight of fear, because the newcomer was not acting like a man under attack. He was acting like a man holding the leash, and the more they pulled against it, the tighter it became around their own throats. That night the man sat in his living room, the tower of papers glowing under the lamp, his eyes calm, his hands steady. He knew the board thought they were still in control, but soon they would understand the truth, that the one they tried to scam was the very man who held the ground beneath their feet. And when that truth came to light, the entire neighborhood would see the empire of the HOA crumble into dust. The following week the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Every morning the man walked outside calmly, collected the stack of papers taped to his door, and placed them neatly on the tower inside. His pile had grown so tall now it looked like a monument of corruption. Neighbors began to whisper louder. Some even gathered near his driveway pretending to chat but secretly waiting to see how he would respond. One evening the board struck harder. They arrived at his door with flashlights and cameras, taking photos of his lawn, his windows, even the cracks in his driveway. They shouted that every detail was a violation. Their voices echoed through the street, hoping to humiliate him, but he simply stood in his doorway, watching silently. His calm eyes unsettled them more than shouting ever could. They finally shoved another packet of fines into his hands and left in a flurry of nervous whispers. The next day letters appeared in the mailboxes of every resident. Official-looking notices claiming that the newcomer was a dangerous troublemaker who refused to follow community rules. They warned everyone to stay away from him, but instead of fear. It sparked quiet anger. People had seen the board's game before, and now they saw how far they were willing to go. That night at the HOA hall the board called an emergency meeting. The president stood in front of the residents and declared that the newcomer was a problem, that he was destroying the harmony of the neighborhood. His voice was loud, filled with fake authority. But as he spoke the man walked calmly to the front. Carrying his tower of papers in a heavy box, he set it down with a thud that echoed like thunder. The residents leaned forward in silence. He spoke in simple, clear words, explaining that every notice, every fine, every violation was false, that none of them appeared in the bylaws. He held up one paper after another, reading the absurd charges. His voice calm but steady. The crowd began to murmur. Their whispers grew louder. Faces turned from confusion to anger. The president slammed his gavel again and again, shouting for order. But his red face and trembling voice betrayed his fear. The man finally looked directly at the board and said in a low, even tone that if these false charges continued, he would not only expose them to the residents but also take the entire pile to higher authorities. The silence that followed was heavy, every neighbor staring, every board member shifting in panic. The president tried to laugh it off, muttering that the newcomer was bluffing. But no one laughed with him. The room had shifted, the balance of fear cracked. After the meeting neighbors gathered around the man outside. Some whispered that they were finally ready to stand up. Others quietly thanked him for doing what they had been too afraid to do. He listened patiently, nodding but saying little. His calmness gave them strength. Meanwhile inside the board office the president slammed the table, his voice rising with desperation. He ordered the others to dig deeper, to find something real, anything that could be used against the man. But the more he shouted the more the board members avoided his eyes. Doubt was spreading among them too, because they all knew something felt different this time. The man was not just a stubborn homeowner, he was something more, someone who carried himself with quiet authority, someone who seemed to know exactly how far their reach truly went. That night the man sat alone in his house, the heavy box of papers beside him. He sipped his coffee and looked out the window at the street where shadows stretched long under the lamps. His patience was nearly over. He had let them dig their own grave deep and wide. And now the time was coming to reveal the truth they feared most, that the homes they lived in, the roofs they slept under, the very walls they thought they ruled, did not truly belong to them at all. The storm inside the community had reached its breaking point. The board was desperate now, their confidence cracked, their voices louder but their grip weaker. They sent threats every day, each one more aggressive, warning of liens, foreclosures, even eviction. Neighbors whispered that the newcomer would soon be ruined. But the man only smiled faintly each morning as he collected the notices and stacked them with the others. The tower now taller than his chair, evidence piled high. He walked calmly, he spoke little. But his silence spread like a ripple through the neighborhood. People began to question what they had feared for so long. One afternoon the board went too far. They arrived at his door with a small group of hired enforcers, not police, not lawyers, just men with sharp suits and colder eyes. They stood behind the president like shadows. The president raised his voice for all the street to hear, declaring the man an unlawful resident, shouting that the board had voted to strip him of his right to live there. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering nervously, some recording on their phones, waiting to see how far it would go. The man stepped out onto his porch. His expression calm as always, he held no papers this time, only his steady voice. He asked the president a single question: who gave him the authority to evict the legal owner of a home? The president shouted back that the board gave him authority, that the community rules were law, but his words trembled as they left his mouth. The man let the silence stretch before he answered, his voice clear, steady, carrying across the street. He said that he had remained patient, that he had gathered every paper, every violation, every false charge, and that it was time the neighborhood knew the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single folded document, not a violation notice, not a fine, but a deed. The neighbors leaned closer, their whispers sharp. He held it up so they could see the official seal. He explained in simple words that through his company he had ownership rights over a large share of the community properties, including rental homes occupied by several of the very board members who stood before him. Gasps spread like fire through the crowd. The president's face drained of color. The men in suits shifted. Uncomfortably, no longer sure who was truly in power, the man continued, his voice still calm, saying that the board had tried to scam him, to bury him in lies, but in truth they had been trying to cheat the very man who held the ground under their feet. The silence that followed was heavy. Neighbors looked at one another with wide eyes, some beginning to smile, others muttering in disbelief. The president stammered, trying to deny it, shouting that it was impossible. But one of the neighbors stepped forward and asked if it was true. Another demanded to know why the board had hidden this. The tide had turned. The fear was breaking. The man folded the deed back into his pocket and looked at the board one last time, his calm gaze making them shrink back. He told them softly that their time of power was over, that every scam they had pulled was now exposed, and that soon they would face more than just angry neighbors, they would face real consequences. The crowd erupted in voices, some cheering, some demanding answers. The board stumbled backward, their control slipping like sand through their fingers, and the man simply turned and walked back into his house, leaving the storm outside to grow. His silence had done what shouting never could. It had revealed the truth, and the board knew in their hearts that their empire was crumbling piece by piece, and there was nothing left they could do to stop it. The night after the deed was revealed, the entire neighborhood buzzed like a hive that had just been struck. Whispers passed from house to house, curtains twitched, phones lit up as residents sent messages to one another. The truth had cracked the wall of fear that the board had built for years. The man sat quietly in his living room, the tower of false violations stacked high beside him, the single deed resting on the table like a sword waiting to be drawn. Outside thunder rolled though the sky was clear. The tension itself felt like a storm. By morning the board tried to act strong. They marched door to door handing out letters claiming the newcomer had lied, that he was dangerous, that the community should not believe him. But their voices shook. Their eyes darted nervously at every window that closed in their faces. People were no longer bowing their heads. They were asking questions, demanding proof, and the board had none. That evening another HOA meeting was called. The hall overflowed with residents, the air thick with expectation. The president walked to the front with his board, his slick hair damp with sweat, his smile forced. He slammed the gavel and shouted that the new resident was a fraud, that he was trying to take over the community. His words echoed but no longer carried weight. Then the man rose slowly, carrying the heavy box of papers and the deed in his hand. He placed the box on the table with a booming thud. The residents leaned forward, phones lifted, recording every second. In calm, steady words he explained everything. How the fake fees began the moment he arrived, how the false violations piled up day after day, how the board threatened and bullied everyone who dared to resist, and finally how the very homes of the board members themselves were tied to his company's ownership. Every word was simple, direct, undeniable. He held up the deed, the seal glinting under the light. The president tried to shout him down but his voice cracked. His hands trembled. The room exploded with voices, residents shouting, demanding answers, some rising to their feet in anger, others clapping for the man who had stood alone against the corruption. The president pounded the gavel again and again until finally it snapped in his hand, a fitting symbol of his broken power. The man lifted one stack of notices from the box and let them fall onto the table. The papers scattered like ashes, each page a lie now exposed to the light. He told the residents that the era of fear was over, that they had been controlled only by threats, and that those threats were empty. The neighbors roared in agreement, some standing, some shouting their own stories of scams. The board members shrank back, their authority collapsing under the weight of truth. The president tried to leave but angry voices followed him. Residents blocked his way, demanding repayment, demanding resignation. The man did not need to raise his voice. He only stood there calm and steady, the center of the storm, the symbol of their freedom. When he finally spoke again his words cut through the noise like steel. He said their power was finished, that every lie, every false fine, Every theft would be documented and delivered to those who would make sure justice was done. The room fell into silence for a moment, the board pale and trembling, the residents wide-eyed with hope. Then, the applause began, slow at first then rising into thunder, shaking the walls of the hall. The president dropped his broken gavel and walked out with his head low, his board trailing behind like shadows fading in the light. Outside the night air was cool and sharp. The neighbors gathered around the man, some clapping his back, some thanking him with tears in their eyes. The fear that had held them for so long was gone, replaced by courage, replaced by the knowledge that the board was powerless. Now, the man walked home slowly, the deed still in his hand, the tower of false papers left behind as evidence of victory. In his house he sat quietly with a faint smile, sipping coffee as always. For him it had never been about shouting or fighting. It had been about patience, about letting the truth rise on its own. And now it had. The HOA that tried to scam him the moment he arrived had forgotten one simple fact, that the homes they ruled with fear did not belong to them. They belonged to him, and with that truth revealed their reign ended in silence, broken not by anger but by calm unshakable truth that no one could deny.